She wasn't asking for rescue when the storm hit, wasn't looking for a hero when her world fell apart on the streets of downtown. But he saw her there, a woman with haunted eyes and a military-issued backpack, soaked to the bone and carrying nothing but the weight of battles both foreign and personal. He was a single father just trying to get home to his teenage son. She was a veteran with nowhere left to turn and secrets buried deeper than most people's graves. Neither of them knew that one simple act of kindness would unlock a truth that would shatter everything they thought they knew about fate, about sacrifice, and about the invisible threads that connect our lives in ways we never see coming. And when that weathered dog tag caught the light and revealed its secret, both their worlds would change forever in ways that prove some debts can never be repaid, only honored. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain started as a whisper, soft droplets against the windshield of Cale Finch's aging Honda Civic as he navigated the winding streets of downtown Ashford Valley. But within minutes, it transformed into something fierce and unrelenting, a Pacific Northwest downpour that turned familiar roads into rivers and made even the most experienced drivers grip their steering wheels a little tighter. Cale leaned forward, his weathered hands steady on the wheel as the wipers worked overtime to clear his view. At 42, he had the kind of face that spoke of hard-earned wisdom, crow's feet from genuine smiles, a beard that was more gray than brown, and eyes that held both warmth and the quiet strength of a man who'd raised a teenager on his own. For the past 8 years. "Dad, you sure we shouldn't just wait this out?" asked Orion from the passenger seat, his 17-year-old voice carrying that particular mix of concern and teenage confidence that Cale had grown to love. The boy, though he hardly looked like a boy anymore at 6 feet tall with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, glanced up from his phone where he'd been tracking the storm. "We'll be fine, son," Cale replied, his voice carrying the calm assurance of a man who'd weathered far worse storms than this. "Besides, you've got that chemistry test tomorrow, and Mrs. Patterson doesn't accept 'got stuck in a storm' as an excuse for missing her review session." Orion grinned, the expression lighting up his angular face. "You know, she'd probably make me take the test in the rain if she had to." They were heading home from Orion's part-time job, Thompson's hardware store, where the boy worked 3 evenings a week to save money for college. Cale was proud of his son's work ethic, though he sometimes worried that Orion had grown up too fast, taking on responsibilities that most teenagers never had to consider. But that was life as a single father. You did what you had to do, and you taught your kids to do the same. Ashford Valley was the kind of mid-sized town that prided itself on its mix of old-world charm and modern sensibility. Tree-lined streets gave way to a bustling downtown district where local coffee shops sat next to tech startups, and where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, usually in the best possible way. Cale had moved here with Orion 9 years ago, after Sarah's death, seeking a place where they could start over without the constant reminders of all they'd lost. He'd found work as a project manager for Clearwater Construction, a local firm that specialized in sustainable building practices. It wasn't the career he'd dreamed of in college. He'd wanted to be an architect, but it paid the bills and gave him the flexibility to be present for Orion when it mattered. Soccer games, parent-teacher conferences, late-night talks about girls in college and the future. Cale had never missed the important stuff. "Look at that," Orion said, pointing through the rain-streaked passenger window as they turned onto Maple Street. "Someone's having a worse night than us." Cale followed his son's gaze and saw her, a figure hunched against the storm, standing beneath the inadequate shelter of a bus stop that offered little protection from the driving rain. Even through the downpour, he could make out details that made his chest tighten with recognition of someone in real trouble. She was a woman, probably in her 30s, wearing what looked like military surplus clothing that had seen better days. A large, military-style backpack sat at her feet, and she held a piece of cardboard over her head in a futile attempt to stay dry. Her dark hair was plastered to her skull, and even from this distance, Cale could see that she was soaked through. But it was her posture that struck him most, the way she stood with her shoulders back, despite the circumstances. The alert way. She scanned her surroundings even while trying to shelter from the storm. There was something unmistakably military about her bearing, a discipline that years of civilian life couldn't completely erase. "Dad," Orion said quietly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "She's been there for at least 20 minutes. I saw her when we drove past earlier." Cale was already slowing down, his foot moving toward the brake before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision. It wasn't really a choice not for him. Sarah had always said that kindness was never optional, especially when you had the means to help. And while Cale's means weren't extensive, he had a warm car and a dry house, which was more than the woman at the bus stop had right now. "What are you doing?" Orion asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "What your mother would have done," Cale replied simply, pulling over to the curb about 20 feet ahead of the bus stop. The rain hammered against the roof of the car as Cale put it in park and turned to his son. "Stay here, okay? I'm going to see if she needs help." Orion nodded, his expression serious. At 17, he'd inherited both his father's compassion and his mother's practical wisdom. "Be careful, Dad." Cale pulled his jacket tighter and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like a physical blow, instantly soaking through his clothes and making the short walk to the bus stop feel like a journey across an ocean. As he approached, the woman looked up, and Cale found himself meeting a pair of dark eyes that held wariness, pride, and something that looked like barely contained exhaustion. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he'd initially thought, probably early 30s, with the kind of lean build that spoke of both military training and too many missed meals. Her olive skin was pale from cold and wet, and there was a small scar above her left eyebrow that caught the streetlight. Most telling of all was the way she watched him approach, alert, assessing, ready to fight or flee despite her obvious vulnerability. "Excuse me," Cale called out over the storm, raising his voice to be heard above the rain. "Are you okay?" She straightened even more, if that was possible, and Cale recognized the reflexive defensiveness of someone who'd learned not to trust easy kindness. "I'm fine," she said, her voice carrying a slight rasp that might have been from the cold or from shouting orders in a previous life. "Just waiting for the bus." Cale glanced at the bus schedule posted behind her, its laminated surface blurred with rain. "Last bus on this route ran an hour ago," he said gently. "Next one won't be until 6 in the morning." For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked, and Cale saw the flash of desperation she'd been hiding. But then she lifted her chin again, and the mask was back in place. "I'll manage," she said. Cale studied her face, seeing past the bravado to the real person underneath, someone who was clearly in trouble, but too proud to ask for help. It reminded him of himself in those dark months after Sarah's death, when well-meaning neighbors had tried to help and he'd pushed them all away, convinced that accepting assistance was somehow a betrayal of his ability to care for his son. "Look," he said, shoving his hands deeper into his jacket pockets. "I've got a 17-year-old in the car who's going to give me grief all the way home if I leave someone standing in this storm. My name's Cale Finch, and I live about 10 minutes from here. I can give you a ride somewhere dry, or at least somewhere you can wait out the worst of this weather." She studied him for a long moment, those dark eyes searching his face for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. Cale stood still and let her look, understanding that trust, once broken, became a luxury that some people couldn't afford. Finally she spoke. "Lyra," she said simply. "Lyra Blackwood." "And I—" She paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "I don't really have anywhere to go." The honesty in that admission hit Cale harder than the rain. Here was someone who'd clearly been through hell, standing in a storm with nowhere to turn, and still finding the courage to admit her need for help. "Then it sounds like we can help each other out," Cale said with a smile that was both warm and respectful. "You get out of the rain, and I get to avoid a lecture from my son about basic human decency." For the first time, something that might have been a smile flickered across Lyra's face. It was gone almost immediately, but it was enough to give Cale hope that underneath all that armor, there was still a person who could accept kindness when it was offered without conditions. "Just until the storm passes," she said, shouldering her backpack with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to traveling light. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Just until the storm passes," Cale agreed, though something in his gut told him that this storm, whatever had brought Lyra Blackwood to that bus stop on this particular night, was going to take more than a few hours to weather. The drive to Cale's house was filled with the awkward silence that comes when strangers find themselves sharing space under unusual circumstances. Lyra sat in the back seat, her military backpack clutched in her lap, water still dripping from her jacket onto the upholstery. Cale caught glimpses of her in the rearview mirror, alert, watchful, like someone who'd learned never to fully relax even in apparent safety. Orion had twisted around to face her, his natural curiosity warring with the politeness his father had drilled into him. "So, Lyra," he said, testing her name carefully, "have you been in Ashford Valley long?" "Not long," she replied, her voice neutral but not unfriendly. "Just passing through." Cale recognized the practiced vagueness of someone who'd learned that the less information you volunteered, the fewer questions you'd have to answer. He'd seen it before in some of the construction workers he'd supervised, veterans who carried their stories like wounds they weren't ready to unwrap. "Well, you picked a hell of a night to be passing through," Cale said, trying to keep the conversation light as he turned onto Birchwood Lane. This storm's supposed to keep up until morning. The neighborhood where Cale and Orion lived was the kind of place where houses had front porches and neighbors actually knew each other's names. Modest but well-maintained homes lined the tree-shaded street, most with gardens that spoke of people who planned to stay put for a while. It was the kind of stability that Cale had deliberately chosen after Sarah's death, place where Orion could put down roots and feel secure. Cale pulled into the driveway of a two-story, craftsman-style house painted a warm blue-gray with white trim. A wraparound porch held 2 rocking chairs and a small table where Orion often did his homework on pleasant evenings. The front yard was neat without being obsessive, and a basketball hoop over the garage spoke of the countless hours father and son had spent shooting hoops and talking about everything and nothing. "This is it," Cale said, turning off the engine. "Not much, but it's home." Lyra looked up at the house through the rain-streaked window, and for just a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her face, longing, maybe, or recognition of something she'd lost. But then her expression shuddered again, and she was back to being the cautious stranger in their back seat. Inside, the house carried the comfortable lived-in feeling of a real home. The living room was centered around a stone fireplace with bookshelves lining one wall and family photos scattered on various surfaces. A well-worn leather couch faced a modest television, and everywhere there were signs of the daily life of a father and teenage son textbooks on the coffee table, a basketball in the corner, a hoodie draped over a chair. "Let me get you a towel," Cale said, disappearing down a hallway while Orion and Lyra stood in the entryway, both suddenly aware of how the dynamics had shifted now that they were in Cale's territory. "Your dad seems nice," Lyra said quietly, more to fill the silence than because she expected a response. Orion nodded, his green eyes serious beyond his 17 years. "He is. He's been taking care of me on his own since I was 9. Mom died in a car accident." He said it matter-of-factly, the way someone shares a fundamental truth about their world. Dad always says we help people because we know what it's like to need help. Something in Lyra's expression softened at that. I'm sorry about your mother. Thanks. I don't remember her as well as I wish I did, but Dad makes sure I know the important stuff. Like how she never walked past someone who needed help. Orion gestured toward the couch. You can sit down, you know. Dad won't mind. Lyra hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the edge of the couch, her backpack still clutched in her arms like a shield. The house was warm, not just the temperature, but the feeling of it. Everything spoke of love and attention, of two people who'd built something meaningful together from the ashes of loss. Cale returned with a stack of towels and a steaming mug. Thought you might like some coffee, he said, offering her the cup. It's nothing fancy, but it's hot. Lyra accepted the mug with both hands, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. Thank you, she said, and for the first time since they'd met her, the words sounded completely genuine. There's a bathroom down the hall if you want to clean up, Cale continued. And I can throw your clothes in the dryer if you'd like. I've probably got something that'll fit you in the meantime. The offer hung in the air between them. Lyra looked from Cale to Orion, both of whom were watching her with expressions of open concern, and something inside her seemed to crack just a little. Why are you doing this? She asked suddenly. You don't know me. I could be dangerous. I could be a person who got caught in a storm and needed help, Cale finished gently. That's all I need to know right now. Lyra stared at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. You really mean that? He does, Orion said quietly. Dad's got this thing about people. He says you can usually tell if someone's good or bad just by paying attention to how they treat people when they think nobody's watching. And what did you see when you were watching me? Lyra asked, curious despite herself. Cale settled into the chair across from her, his expression thoughtful. I saw someone who's been through hell but still says thank you when someone hands her a cup of coffee. Someone who stands up straight even when life's trying to knock her down. Someone who ... He paused, studying her face. Someone who looks like they've served in the military and knows what it means to look out for other people. Lyra's hand instinctively moved to her chest, where something hung beneath her shirt, a reflexive gesture that neither Cale nor Orion missed, though neither commented on it. Army, she said finally. 3 tours, Afghanistan and Iraq. The words hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, carrying with them the weight of everything she wasn't saying. Cale nodded with the respect of someone who understood that some experiences couldn't be explained, only acknowledged. Thank you for your service, he said simply. Lyra's laugh was short and bitter, for all the good it did. She caught herself, seeming surprised by her own honesty. Sorry, I don't usually ... Don't apologize, Cale said. You're safe here. Both of you, whatever you've been through, whatever brought you to that bus stop tonight, you're safe here. Something in his voice seemed to reach her, because Lyra's grip on her backpack finally loosened. She set it down beside the couch and took a real sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through her chest. I should probably call someone, she said after a moment. Let them know where I am. The way she said it made it clear that there probably wasn't anyone to call, but Cale didn't press. Instead, he stood up and gestured toward the hallway. Phones. In the kitchen if you need it. And that offer of dry clothes still stands. Lyra looked around the living room one more time at the family photos, at Orion curled up in his chair with a textbook, at the warm light spilling from table lamps that spoke of home and safety, and all the things she'd forgotten could exist. Okay, she said quietly, maybe just for tonight. As she followed Cale down the hallway, her hand once again moved to whatever she wore beneath her shirt, a gesture so automatic she probably didn't realize she was doing it. Behind them, Orion watched her go with the observant eyes of a young man who'd learned to read people's stories in their silences. though he had no idea yet how closely this particular story was connected to his own. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the blue-gray house on Birchwood Lane, three people who'd been strangers an hour ago were beginning to discover that sometimes the most important connections are the ones we never see coming. An hour later, Lyra emerged from the bathroom wearing one of Cale's old flannel shirts and a pair of sweatpants that were too long for her frame, but infinitely more comfortable than her rain-soaked clothes. Her dark hair was damp but clean, pulled back in a simple ponytail that made her look younger somehow, less guarded. The military bearing was still there, but softened around the edges by warmth and basic human comfort. Cale had built a fire in the stone fireplace, and the living room now glowed with the kind of golden light that made everything feel safer, more intimate. Orion was sprawled on the floor doing homework, occasionally muttering about chemical equations, while Cale sat in his usual chair with a steaming mug of his own coffee. "Feel better?" he asked as Lyra settled back onto the couch, this time allowing herself to sink into its worn comfort, rather than perching on the edge like she might need to flee at any moment. "Much," she admitted, wrapping her hands around the fresh cup of coffee he'd prepared for her. "I can't remember the last time I had a hot shower." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she immediately looked embarrassed by the forest. Admission. Cale pretended not to notice her discomfort. "Well, you're welcome to stay until the storm passes. Longer if you need to." "I don't want to impose," Lyra said quickly, but her voice lacked the sharp edge it had carried earlier. "You're not," Orion said without looking up from his textbook. "Dad actually likes having people around. He gets weird when it's just us for too long, starts reorganizing the spice rack and color-coding his tool collection." "I do not color-code my tools," Cale protested with mock indignation. "Dad, your wrenches are arranged by size and finish. That's basically color-coding with extra steps." Lyra found herself smiling, a real smile this time, not the careful expression she'd been wearing like armor. "Sounds like you keep him in line. Someone has to," Orion said with a grin. "He's been a mess since Mom died. I mean, he tries to hide it, but the man once made me pancakes for dinner 3 nights in a row because he forgot how to make actual food." "They were good pancakes," Cale said defensively. "They were terrible pancakes," Orion corrected. "You put salt instead of sugar in the batter." Despite the teasing tone, Lyra could hear the love underneath their banter. It was the kind of easy affection that comes from years of being a team, of facing the world together. She found herself envying it even as she was warmed by it. "What happened?" she asked quietly, the question directed at both of them but somehow landing on Cale. "To your wife, I mean. If you don't mind talking about it." Cale was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Car accident," he said finally. "Orion was 9. Sarah was coming home from a late shift at the hospital. She was a nurse, and a drunk driver ran a red light." He took a sip of coffee, his hands steady despite the pain that flickered across his face. "She died instantly. They said she didn't suffer." "I'm sorry," Lyra said, and the words carried a weight that suggested she understood loss in ways that went beyond polite sympathy. "The worst part," Cale continued, "wasn't losing her, though that nearly killed me. It was watching Orion try to take care of me while he was grieving too. Kid was 9 years old, and he was the one making sure I ate, making sure I got up in the morning." Orion looked up from his homework, his green eyes serious. "You were pretty messed up for a while there, Dad." "Yeah, I was," Cale admitted without shame. "Took me longer than it should have to realize that Orion needed me to be his father, not another person he had to worry about." Lyra watched the exchange between them, recognizing something she'd seen in military families, the way trauma could either destroy people or forge them into something stronger. "It shows," she said, "how close you are. You can see it in how you take care of each other. What about you?" Orion asked, closing his textbook and giving her his full attention. Do you have family? Lyra's expression grew distant. Not anymore. My parents died when I was 18. House fire. I joined the army right after because I didn't know what else to do with myself. She paused, her fingers absently moving to touch whatever hung beneath her shirt. Made some good friends in the service, though. People who became like family. Made? Cale asked gently, picking up on the past tense. Lost some of them along the way, Lyra said simply. That's what happens in war zones. You learn to love people, knowing you might lose them. The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the continued drumming of rain against the windows. There was something sacred about shared grief. Lyra realized it created a space where pretense became unnecessary and real connection could begin. Is that why you're... Cale began, then stopped himself. Sorry, none of my business. Homeless? Lyra finished for him. You can say it. It's what I am. She took a long sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. I got out of the army 2 years ago. Tried to make it work, got a job, an apartment, the whole civilian thing. But I kept having these episodes. Panic. Attacks, nightmares, anger that came out of nowhere. Lost the job, couldn't make rent. Pride wouldn't let me ask for help until it was too late. PTSD. Orion asked with the matter-of-fact directness of his generation. Lyra nodded. Among other things. There are programs, services, people who want to help. But sometimes the bureaucracy is harder to navigate than the actual war was. And sometimes... She trailed off, her hand once again touching whatever she wore beneath her shirt. Sometimes you feel like you don't deserve the help. Why would you think that? Cale asked, his voice gentle but firm. You served your country. You earned every bit of support they can give you. Lyra's smile was sad and complicated. Survivor's guilt is a funny thing. When your friends don't come home, it's hard to feel like you deserve happiness when they'll never get the chance to have it. Orion was watching her with the intense focus of someone trying to understand something important. But they wouldn't want you to be miserable, would they? Your friends who didn't make it home. The simplicity of the question hit Lyra like a physical blow. She stared at the 17-year-old boy who'd lost his mother, but still had enough wisdom to see through. To the heart of her pain. No, she said quietly. They wouldn't. Then maybe, Orion said with the careful wisdom of someone who'd learned hard lessons young. You're not honoring their memory by punishing yourself. Maybe you're dishonoring it. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, then at Cale, who was watching. His son with obvious pride. You raised a pretty smart kid, she said. He gets that from his mother, Cale replied. The wisdom, anyway. The stubbornness is all me. Outside, the storm showed no signs of letting up, but inside the warm circle of firelight, something was shifting. The careful walls that Lyra had built around herself were beginning to show cracks, and through those cracks, something that looked remarkably like hope was starting to seep in. Thank you, she said suddenly, looking from Cale to Orion and back. Again, for all of this. For seeing me as a person instead of just another problem to solve. Everyone deserves to be seen, Cale said simply. Everyone deserves to be safe. As if responding to his words, Lyra's hand moved once more to touch whatever hung beneath her shirt. A gesture so automatic she seemed unaware of it, but both Cale and Orion noticed, and though neither said anything, they both filed the observation away, sensing that whatever she carried there was important. Though they couldn't yet understand why that morning came quietly to Ashford Valley, the storm having finally exhausted itself sometime before dawn. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the blue-gray house on Birchwood Lane, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floors and filling the rooms with the kind of gentle warmth that made everything seem possible. Lyra woke on the couch to the smell of bacon and the sound of quiet conversation from the kitchen. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliarity of waking up somewhere safe. It had been months since she'd slept through the night without jolting awake at every sound. But something about this house, the steady rhythm of a real home, had allowed her to rest in a way she'd forgotten was possible. She could hear Cale and Orion moving around the kitchen, their morning routine as comfortable and practiced as a dance. The domestic normalcy of it made her chest tight with something she didn't want to name. This was what she'd fought for overseas, what she'd thought she was protecting, the simple beauty of families being families, of people taking care of each other without fanfare or expectation of reward. "Dad, she's still asleep," she heard Orion whisper, his voice carrying clearly through the open floor plan. "Should we wake her up for breakfast?" "Let her sleep," Cale replied quietly. "She probably hasn't had a good night's rest in a long time." Lyra smiled despite herself. Even half awake, she could hear the kindness in his voice, the automatic consideration for someone else's needs. It was the kind of thoughtfulness that seemed to come naturally to him, probably learned from years of single parenthood and reinforced by whatever Sarah had taught him about taking care of people. She sat up slowly, running her hands through her hair and looking around the living room in the morning light. Last night, exhausted and overwhelmed, she'd barely taken in the details. Now she could see the careful way this house had been put together, not expensive, but intentional. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every small decoration spoke of a life built with love and attention. "Good morning," she called out, standing and folding the blanket Cale had left for her the night before. "Hey, you're up," Orion said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with a plate in his hand. "Dad made his famous blueberry pancakes." "Well, famous in our house anyway." Cale emerged behind him, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Lyra admitted. "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Cale said with a grin. "Wait until you taste the pancakes." Orion's being generous with the word famous. They ate breakfast at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through windows that looked out onto a backyard where a vegetable garden was just beginning to show green shoots. The conversation was easy, comfortable, in a way that surprised all of them. Lyra found herself laughing at Orion's stories about his co-workers at Thompson's hardware store, and contributing her own tales of military life that were carefully edited to include only the funny moments, the bonds between soldiers, the small victories that made the hard times bearable. "So what's the plan for today?" Cale asked as they finished eating. "I called into work, told them I needed a personal day. Orion doesn't have school because of the storm damage downtown." Lyra looked surprised. "You didn't have to do that. I can figure something out. Find somewhere to go." "Where to go?" "Where?" Orion asked bluntly, but not unkindly. "The bus station? Another bus stop?" "Come on, Lyra. The storm's over, but that doesn't mean you have to go back to living rough." Cale shot his son a look that was equal parts pride and mild exasperation. What Orion is trying to say, with all the subtlety of a brick through a window, is that you're welcome to stay as long as you need to. At least until you figure out your next step. Lyra looked between them, these two people who'd known her for less than 24 hours, but were offering her something she hadn't dared hope for: time, space, the luxury of not having to constantly worry about where she'd sleep or when she'd eat next. "I don't want to be a burden," she said quietly. "You won't be," Cale said firmly. "Actually, I've been meaning to tackle some projects around here that I could use help with, if you're interested. Nothing major, just some organizational stuff in the garage, maybe help with the garden. Sarah always had better luck with plants than I do." It was an offer of dignity wrapped in kindness, not charity, but partnership. Lyra recognized it for what it was and felt something inside her chest loosen just a little more. "I'd like that," she said. The day unfolded with the easy rhythm of people who were comfortable in each other's company. Lyra proved to have an instinctive understanding of organization that came from years of military efficiency, and she worked alongside Cale in the garage, sorting through boxes of tools and supplies with the kind of systematic approach that impressed him. "You're good at this," he said, watching her create logical groupings of hardware and supplies. "Ever think about project management?" Lyra paused in her sorting. "Actually, that's what I did in the Army. Logistics coordination. Making sure the right supplies got to the right places at the right times." She smiled ruefully. "Turns out those skills don't translate as well to civilian jobs as the recruiters claimed." "Maybe you just hadn't found the right opportunity yet," Cale said thoughtfully. "Clearwater Construction is always looking for people who understand how to manage complex projects. It's not military logistics, but it's not that different either." Meanwhile, Orion had appointed himself as the official supervisor of their work, offering commentary and bringing them drinks while he worked on a school project at the kitchen table. Watching him interact with Lyra, Cale was struck by how easily his son had accepted her presence, how naturally he included her in the casual jokes and observations that made up their daily life. "You're good with him," Cale said during a break, nodding toward Orion, who was explaining something about chemistry to Lyra with the passionate intensity that only a teenager could bring to a subject. "He's a good kid," Lyra replied, watching. Orion gestured enthusiastically as he talked. "You've done an amazing job with him. Sarah would be proud." The casual mention of his wife's name might have felt intrusive coming from someone else, but from Lyra it felt natural, like an acknowledgement of the love that had built this family rather than an intrusion into private grief. "Some days I feel like I'm just making it up as I go along," Cale admitted. "Single parenting doesn't come with a manual. Neither does military service," Lyra said. "But you learn to trust your instincts, rely on your training, and ask for help when you need. It seems like you've figured that out pretty well." As the afternoon wore on, Lyra found herself settling into the rhythms of the household in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. She helped Orion with his chemistry homework, drawing on knowledge she'd gained from handling explosive materials overseas. She worked with Cale to organize his tools, bringing military precision to civilian chaos. And through it all, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sense of being useful, valued, part of something larger than her own survival. It was while they were working together in the garage, Lyra reaching overhead to arrange items on a high shelf, that her shirt rode up slightly and something metallic caught the light. Cale caught a glimpse of a chain around her neck, disappearing beneath her shirt, but he looked away quickly, respecting her privacy. Still, the brief flash of metal registered in his mind, filed away with all the other small details he'd been noticing about this woman who'd stumbled into their lives during a storm. There was something about the way she carried herself, something about the automatic way her hand moved to touch whatever hung around her neck when she was thinking deeply, that suggested the chain held more significance than simple jewelry. But those were thoughts for later. For now, there was work to be done, a family rhythm to maintain, and a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected addition to their household was exactly what they'd all been missing without knowing it. As evening approached, and they worked together to prepare dinner, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in borrowed time, that this sense of belonging was too good to last. But for now, surrounded by the easy warmth of Cale and Orion's companionship, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, sometimes, good things did happen to people who'd forgotten they deserved them. 3 days had passed since the storm, and Lyra was beginning to understand what the word home actually meant. Not the house itself, though Cale's craftsman bungalow had become a sanctuary she cherished, but the feeling of being woven into the daily fabric of other people's lives. The way Orion automatically set 3 places at the table now. The way Cale included her in decisions about weekend plans. The way she'd started thinking in terms of we instead of I. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. This morning found her in the backyard with Cale, working on Sarah's vegetable garden while Orion was at his, Saturday shift at Thompson's hardware store. The spring soil was rich and dark between her fingers, and she was surprised by how therapeutic it felt to coax life from the earth after so many years of witnessing destruction. Sarah planted this the year before she died, Cale said, kneeling beside a patch where green shoots were just beginning to emerge. She always said that gardens were acts of faith. You plant seeds believing in a future you might not see. Lyra looked up from the tomato seedling she was transplanting. Do you think she'd mind me working in her garden? Cale's smile was soft and certain. Sarah believed that good things were meant to be shared. She'd probably say the garden's been waiting for the right hands to tend it again. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the spring sun warming their shoulders as they prepared the soil for new growth. Lyra found herself thinking about the future in a way she hadn't dared to in months, not just surviving the next day or finding the next safe place to sleep, but actually building something, contributing, belonging. Cale, she said suddenly, then paused, unsure how to voice what she was feeling. What's on your mind? I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. About Clearwater construction, about using my logistics experience in construction management. She sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. Do you really think there might be an opportunity there? Cale stopped digging and gave her his full attention. I know there is. We just landed a contract for a new residential development on the outskirts of town, 60 houses over the next 2 years. The project manager they hired quit last week, said the job was too complex, too many moving parts. He grinned. Sound familiar? Coordinating supply chains for forward operating bases in hostile territory, Lyra said dryly. Yeah, I might have some relevant experience. I could talk to my boss, set up a meeting. It wouldn't be charity. They need someone with your skills, and they need them now. The possibility hung in the air between them, bright with promise but also weighted with Lyra's deep-seated fear of disappointment. She'd tried to build a civilian life before, tried to be the person she was before the war, and it had all come crashing down around her. What if I'm not ready? She asked quietly. What if I have an episode, or freeze up, or ... Then we'll figure it out, Cale said simply. You won't be doing it alone. Before Lyra could respond, her phone, a battered prepaid device she'd managed to hold on to through everything, buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and froze. The number wasn't one she recognized, but the area code was. It was from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where she'd been stationed during her last tour. I should take this, she said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. Military stuff. Cale nodded and continued working, giving her privacy as she walked toward the back porch to answer. Blackwood, she said, automatically reverting to military protocol. Lyra, thank God, it's Tony Martinez from your old unit. Lyra's heart started beating faster. Tony had been her squad leader during her final deployment, a career NCO who'd looked out for his people like they were his own family. If he was calling her personal number. Tony, how did you get this number? Had to do some digging. Listen, I've got news. Bad news and good news. Which do you want first? Lyra closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of military communications settle around her like a heavy coat. Bad news first, always. Rodriguez didn't make it. Lost his fight with PTSD last month. I know you two were close. Close. The words hit her like a physical blow. Jimmy Rodriguez had been her partner in logistics coordination, a kid from Texas with an infectious laugh and a talent for finding humor in the worst situations. They'd saved each other's lives more than once, both literally and figuratively, during their time overseas. Lyra, you still there? Yeah, she managed, her voice thick. Yeah, I'm here. What's the good news? He left something for you. A letter and something else. His family wants to honor his wishes and get them to you, but they need an address. Are you ... Are you stable? Somewhere safe? Lyra looked back at the garden where Cale was still working, at the house where Orion would be returning from work. In a few hours, at the life she'd been afraid to believe in for the past 3 days. "Yeah," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm somewhere safe." She gave Tony the address on Birchwood Lane, feeling strange saying it out loud, as if claiming it might make it disappear. After she hung up, she stood on the porch for a long moment, processing the complicated grief of losing someone who'd shared the worst experiences of her life, someone who'd understood things that couldn't be explained to civilians. Everything. "Okay?" Cale asked when she returned to the garden. He must have seen something in her expression, because he immediately stood and moved closer, his eyes full of concern. "A friend from my unit died," she said simply. "Suicide. His family wants to send me something he left for me." Cale's face softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. He was a good soldier. A good person. Just couldn't find his way back from the war." She knelt back down among the tomato plants, needing the physical activity to keep her hands steady. "Sometimes I think the real battle doesn't start until you come home." They worked together quietly for the rest of the morning, but Lyra was aware of Cale's continued presence in a way that felt like an anchor. When grief threatened to pull her under, he was there, not trying to fix anything or offer empty platitudes, just solid and present and real. Orion returned from work around noon, full of stories about eccentric customers and hardware store drama, and his easy chatter helped pull Lyra back to the present. They made lunch together, the three of them moving around the kitchen with the kind of choreographed ease that develops when people actually enjoy each other's company. It was while they were cleaning up that Orion noticed Lyra seemed quieter than usual. "You okay?" he asked with the directness that seemed to be a family trait. "You look like something's bothering you." Lyra hesitated, then found herself telling him about Rodriguez, about the friend she'd lost and the complicated feelings that came with surviving when others didn't. Orion listened with the kind of focused attention that reminded her why she'd connected with this family so quickly. They didn't just hear words, they listened for understanding. "That sucks," Orion said when she finished, and the simple honesty of it made her smile despite her sadness. "But I'm glad his family knows where to find you now. Sometimes having something to remember people by helps. What do you have to remember your mom?" Lyra asked gently. Orion's face lit up. "Lots of stuff. Dad kept everything important. Want to see?" Before either adult could object, he was leading them to Cale's bedroom, where a cedar chest sat at the foot of the bed. Cale followed with obvious reluctance, but didn't stop his son from opening it. Inside were the treasures of a life shared and a love remembered. Photographs, letters, a pressed flower from Sarah and Cale's wedding bouquet, a hospital bracelet from Orion's birth. But what caught Lyra's attention was a small wooden box that Orion lifted out with particular care. "This is Mom's jewelry," he said, opening it to reveal a collection of simple but beautiful pieces. "Dad says I can give some of it to the woman I marry someday, but for now it's just nice to know it's here." Lyra found herself studying the contents of the box, a pearl necklace, simple gold earrings, a bracelet made of braided silver. But it was the empty space in one corner that drew her attention, a depression in the velvet lining that suggested something specific had once been kept there. What used to be in that spot? She asked without thinking. Cale and Orion both looked where she was pointing, and something shifted in Cale's expression. "Her necklace," he said quietly. "A gold chain with a small pendant. Sarah wore it every day, but ... He trailed off, his voice growing tight with memory. "But what?" Lyra asked gently. "She gave it away," Orion said, his young voice full of old sadness. "The day before she died. To someone who saved my life." The words hit Lyra like electricity, and her hand moved instinctively to the chain around her own neck. The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thinner, as connections began forming in her mind, dangerous, impossible connections that couldn't be real. saved your life?" she managed to ask. Cale nodded, his eyes distant with memory. Orion was 9. "We were visiting Sarah at the hospital where she worked. There was an accident. A car jumped the curb, heading straight for him. A soldier on leave happened to be there, pulled him out of the way at the last second." His voice grew thick with emotion. "Sarah insisted on thanking her, gave her the necklace right off her own neck. Said anyone who saved her son deserved something. Precious." Lyra's heart was pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. Her fingers found the chain beneath her shirt, felt the familiar weight of the small gold pendant she'd worn every day for 8 years, without really understanding why she couldn't bring herself to take it off. "Do you remember anything else about her?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The soldier?" Orion was the one who answered, his green eyes serious as he searched his memory. "She had dark hair like yours. And she was crying when Mom gave her the necklace, said she didn't deserve it. But Mom told her that heroes don't get to decide what they deserve." The world tilted sideways. Lyra stood there in Cale's bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of Sarah's love, and felt 8 years of carefully constructed emotional walls crumble all at once. Because she remembered that day too. Remembered the little boy with green eyes who'd been about to be hit by a drunk driver. Remembered the woman with kind eyes who'd insisted on giving her a piece of jewelry, despite being obviously exhausted from her own medical treatments. Remembered driving away from that hospital, knowing she'd carry the memory of that family's gratitude for the rest of her life. And now she was standing in their home. The little boy had grown into the young man who'd been offering her wisdom about survivor's guilt. The woman who'd given her the necklace had been Cale's wife, Orion's mother, the person whose garden she'd been tending all morning. The pendant around her neck suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The silence in the bedroom stretched like a held breath, heavy with the weight of memory and the impossible mathematics of coincidence. Lyra stood frozen, her hand pressed against the chain beneath her shirt, feeling the familiar edges of the pendant that had become as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. 8 years. 8 years she'd worn this necklace, never quite understanding why she couldn't bring herself to take it off, why it felt like removing it would be a betrayal of something sacred. She'd told herself it was a reminder of a good deed, a symbol of the kind of person she'd tried to be before the war changed her. But now, standing in this room surrounded by the life that had grown from that single moment of instinct and courage, she understood it was something far more complex. "Lyra?" Cale's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing now the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, just like they had 8 years ago when he'd stood beside his wife's hospital bed, holding the hand of a 9-year-old boy who'd almost been killed by a drunk driver. She'd thought then that he had kind eyes, the eyes of a good father. She'd been right about that. She started, then stopped, her throat constricting around words that felt too big, too impossible to speak aloud. Orion was watching her with growing concern, his green eyes his mother's eyes, studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Are you okay? You look like you're about to pass out." Lyra's hand moved again to the chain around her neck, the gesture now deliberate rather than unconscious. Both Cale and Orion noticed, their gazes following the movement. "The necklace," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one Sarah gave to the soldier. Can you describe it?" Cale's brow furrowed, but he answered. "Gold chain, delicate." The pendant was small, maybe the size of a quarter. It had an inscription on the back, Sarah's initials, and a date. Lyra felt the room tilt around her. Her fingers found the clasp at the back of her neck, and with trembling hands, she lifted the chain over her head. The pendant caught the afternoon light streaming through the bedroom window as she held it out, the gold surface worn smooth from years of wear. "SF June 15th, 2010, she read from the back of the pendant, her voice breaking on each character, The silence that followed was so complete that Lyra could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Cale stared at the necklace in her palm as if it were something impossible, something that couldn't exist in the real world. Orion's face had gone completely white. "That's—" Cale's voice failed him. He reached out as if to touch the pendant, then stopped, his hand hovering in the air. Between them. "That's Sarah's necklace. His necklace." "June 15th, 2010, Orion whispered, his young voice heavy with dawning realization. "That's the day Mom gave it away." "The day." He looked up at Lyra, his green eyes wide with something between wonder and shock. "You're her. You're the soldier who saved my life." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming everything in the room, everything between them. Lyra nodded, tears streaming down her face now without shame or attempt to hide them. "I remember you," she said, looking at Orion with eyes that saw both the 17-year-old young man before her and the 9-year-old boy who'd been about to step into traffic. "You were wearing a blue t-shirt with a dinosaur on it. You were excited about something. I think you'd just gotten a good grade on a test." Orion's hand flew to his mouth. "I remember. You came out of nowhere. One second, I was walking toward Dad's car, and the next second, someone was pulling me back, and there was this car where I would have been standing. You scraped your knee when we fell," Lyra continued, the memory crystal clear now that she was allowing herself to access it fully. "You were more worried about your t-shirt being dirty than about being hurt. And you were crying," Orion said softly. "You kept saying it was just instinct, that anyone would have done the same thing." Cale had been listening to this exchange with the stunned expression of a man watching his world reorganize itself into an entirely new configuration. "You saved my son's life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 8 years ago, you saved Orion's life, and now ... And now I'm living in your house," Lyra finished, the impossibility of it all threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm sleeping on your couch, working in your wife's garden, wearing the necklace she gave me for saving your son's life." The room fell silent again as all three of them tried to process the magnitude of what they'd discovered. This wasn't just coincidence, it was something larger, more complex, something that felt like the universe itself had been orchestrating events beyond their understanding. "This is why you couldn't take it off," Cale said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the necklace still cradled in Lyra's palm. "The necklace. You said you'd had it for years, but never explained why it was important." Lyra nodded. "I tried once, about 2 years ago when things got really bad and I thought about selling it for food money, but I couldn't. It felt like—" She struggled for words. "Like it would be betraying something sacred. I never understood why until now." "Because it connected you to us," Orion said with the simple clarity that seemed to be his gift. "Even when you didn't know it, it was keeping you connected to our family." The truth of that statement hit all of them like a physical force. Lyra had been carrying a piece of their family story with her for 8 years, through 3 tours of duty, through PTSD and homelessness and all the dark nights when she'd questioned whether her life had any meaning or purpose. "I don't understand," Lyra said, her voice breaking. "I don't understand how this is possible. How I ended up here, in your lives, wearing your wife's necklace after all this time." Cale stepped forward then, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked uncertain, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical safety and everything to do with the heart. "Maybe," he said carefully, "some debts can't be repaid in traditional ways. Maybe they get paid forward instead, in ways we never see coming." "But this is crazy," Lyra said, gesturing between all of them. "This doesn't happen in real life. People don't just stumble into the lives of the families they helped years ago. Doesn't it?" Orion asked quietly. "Because it seems like it just did." Lyra looked down at the necklace in her palm, this small piece of gold that had somehow bridged 8 years and countless miles to bring her back to the family she'd helped without ever knowing she'd done so. The pendant seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light, as if it were more than just metal and memory, as if it were somehow alive, with the love that had created it and the love that had sustained it. "I don't know what this means," she whispered. "Neither do we," Cale said gently, "but maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't have to understand it to be grateful for it." As the afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows of Sarah's bedroom, 3 people stood in the presence of something larger than themselves, something that spoke to the invisible threads that connect human lives in ways both mysterious and magnificent. And while none of them could yet understand what this revelation would mean for their future, they all knew that everything had changed, and that change, like the necklace itself, was both beautiful and terrifying in its implications. The pendant lay in Lyra's open palm like a bridge between past and present, between debt and gift, between the person she'd been 8 years ago and the woman she was becoming in the warmth of this unexpected family's love. The hours following the revelation passed in a strange, suspended kind of silence. Dinner was prepared and eaten with mechanical efficiency, conversation limited to practical necessities. "Pass the salt. More water. Are you finished with that plate?" It was as if all 3 of them were afraid that speaking about what they'd discovered might somehow make it disappear, or worse, reveal it to be some kind of elaborate delusion. Lyra found herself studying Cale and Orion when she thought they weren't looking, searching their faces for signs of how they were processing the impossible truth that had been unveiled in Sarah's bedroom. But their expressions were carefully neutral, polite in a way that felt more distant than the wariness she'd encountered that first night in the storm. After Orion excused himself to do homework, though Lyra suspected he was really just giving the adults space to talk, she and Cale sat in the living room with the television on, but neither of them watching it. The necklace lay on the coffee table between them, its presence as heavy as a stone dropped into still water. "I should go," Lyra said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched for nearly an hour. Cale looked up from the book he'd been pretending to read. "What?" "I should leave, tonight. Tomorrow morning at the latest." She gestured toward the necklace. "This changes everything. You took me in because I was a stranger who needed help, but I'm not a stranger, am I? I'm the person who saved your son's life, and you've been—" She struggled for words. "You've been paying a debt you didn't even know you owed." "That's not what this is," Cale said firmly, setting his book aside. "Isn't it?" Lyra's voice carried a bitter edge that hadn't been there since her first night in their home. "Come on, Cale. You're a good man, a decent man. How could you possibly ask me to leave now? How could you not feel obligated to help me, knowing what you know?" Cale was quiet for a moment, and that pause, just a few seconds too long, was enough to confirm Lyra's worst fears. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I don't know how to separate what I'm feeling from what I think I should be feeling." The honesty in his voice was like a knife to her chest. Lyra had survived firefights and IED explosions, had lived through the death of friends and the dissolution of her civilian life. But this felt like it might actually break her. "Then you understand why I have to go," she said, standing up from the couch. "I can't stay here knowing that every kindness you show me is tainted by obligation. I can't become someone's burden disguised as someone's blessing." "Lyra, wait," but she was already moving toward the stairs, toward the guest room where her few belongings waited. Behind her, she heard Cale's footsteps, heard him calling her name, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The weight of what they'd discovered was crushing her, making it impossible to breathe, impossible to think clearly. She was throwing clothes into her backpack when Orion appeared in the doorway, his young face tight with confusion and something that looked like panic. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Packing," Lyra said without looking up. "I'm leaving." "Because of the necklace? Because you saved my life?" The simple directness of his question made her hand still on the zipper of her pack. "It's complicated, Orion." "No, it's not." He stepped into the room, his green eyes fierce with the kind of clarity that only teenagers could bring to complex adult emotions. "It's only complicated if you make it complicated. You saved my life 8 years ago. So what? That doesn't make this," he gestured around the room, toward the house, toward the life they'd been building together, "any less real." "You don't understand," Lyra said, resuming her packing with renewed urgency. "Your father feels obligated to help me now." "Everything changes when Dad felt obligated to help you the first night," Orion interrupted. "That's just who he is. But obligation doesn't make someone laugh at your stories over breakfast. Obligation doesn't make someone trust you to reorganize their garage or work in their wife's garden." Lyra's hands stilled again. "Orion ... You think Dad spent 3 days getting to know you because he felt sorry for you? You think I shared my mom's jewelry box with you because I thought you were some charity case?" Orion's voice was rising, now passionate with the conviction of someone who'd inherited his father's capacity for seeing truth clearly. "You think any of this has been about obligation?" From downstairs came the sound of Cale's voice, calling both their names with increasing urgency. "Urgency. He cares about you," Orion said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "And not because you saved my life. Because of who you are. Because you make him smile in a way he hasn't smiled since Mom died. Because you fit into our family like a piece we didn't know was missing." Tears were streaming down Lyra's face now, but she shook her head stubbornly. "You can't know that. He can't know that. Not anymore. The necklace changes everything." "The only thing the necklace changes," Orion said firmly, "is that now we know why you were supposed to find us." Before Lyra could respond to that, Cale appeared behind his son in the doorway, his face flushed from running up the stairs. "Don't go," he said simply. "I have to," Lyra replied, her voice breaking. "Don't you see? I can't stay here knowing that. You're only helping me because what?" Cale stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving her face. "Because 8 years ago you made a split-second decision that saved my son's life? Because my wife, in her infinite wisdom, gave you something precious to carry with you? Because the universe somehow arranged for you to end up on that bus stop during that storm so I could return a kindness you'd already given us?" "Yes," Lyra whispered. "All of that." Cale moved closer, close enough that she could see the tears gathering in his own eyes. "What if you're looking at this backwards?" "What do you mean? What if the debt isn't mine to pay? What if Sarah giving you that necklace wasn't payment for saving Orion? What if it was a down payment on the family you'd need 8 years later?" The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. She stared at Cale, at this man who'd become so important to her so quickly, and saw something in his face that transcended obligation or guilt or any simple emotion. "What if," he continued, his voice gentle but certain, "the reason you couldn't take off that necklace wasn't because it reminded you of a good deed, but because it was keeping you connected to the people who were always supposed to be your family? What if finding us wasn't coincidence or cosmic debt? What if it was just coming home?" Lyra's knees gave out then, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the possibility he was suggesting. That this wasn't about obligation at all. That it was about love, the kind that transcends time and circumstance, and the careful logic that says families have to be built from blood or legal documents. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of what?" Orion asked, settling beside her on the bed while his father knelt in front of them both. "Of believing it," she said. "Of believing that I deserve this, that I deserve you." Cale reached out and took her hands in his touch warm and steady and absolutely certain. "What if deserve has nothing to do with it? What if this is just love, and love doesn't care about what anybody deserves?" The room fell silent except for the sound of 3 people breathing, 3 hearts beating in rhythm with something larger than any of them had dared to hope for. Outside, evening was settling over Ashford Valley, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell was ringing the hour. Stay, Kale said quietly, please. Not because of the necklace, not because of obligation, not because of anything that happened 8 years ago. Stay because this is your home now. Stay because we love you. Lyra looked from Kale to Orion and back again. These two people who'd become her anchor in a world that had felt untethered for so long. The necklace still lay on the coffee table. Downstairs, but its weight no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like what it had always been, a bridge between the person she'd been and the person she was becoming. Between the life she'd lost and the life she was finally brave enough to claim. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay. And for the first time since the revelation in Sarah's bedroom, the silence that followed felt like peace rather than uncertainty, like the quiet that comes not before a storm, but after one has finally passed. Morning after their revelation brought with it a different kind of peace, not the careful politeness of strangers learning to coexist, but the deeper quiet of people who had looked at the most complicated truth about their connection and chosen to build something beautiful from it anyway. Lyra woke to the familiar sounds of Kale and Orion's morning routine, but this time she didn't feel like an observer of their family life. She felt like a participant. The shift was subtle but profound, like the difference between watching a fire from outside a window and sitting close enough to feel its warmth on your skin. She found them in the kitchen, Kale reading construction plans over coffee while Orion ate cereal and worked on what appeared to be a physics problem that involved far too many equations for such an early hour. Morning, Kale said, looking up with a smile that was both familiar and different, warmer, somehow less careful. Coffee's fresh. Thanks, Lyra said, pouring herself a cup and settling at the table with them. For a moment, none of them spoke. But it wasn't the loaded silence of the previous day. It was the comfortable quiet of people who had things to say, but weren't rushing to say them. I called my boss this morning, Kale said finally, setting down his coffee cup. About the project manager position at Clearwater. Lyra's pulse quickened. And he wants to meet with you today, if you're interested. Kale's expression was carefully neutral, giving her space to make her own decision. I told him about your military logistics background, your experience with complex operations. I didn't mention the rest. The rest, their personal connection, the necklace, the impossible way their lives had intertwined. Lyra appreciated that. He understood the distinction, that she needed this opportunity to be about her qualifications, not their history. I'm interested, she said, more than interested. Terrified, but interested. Good terrified or bad terrified? Orion asked, looking up from his homework. Good terrified, Lyra said after thinking about it. The kind that means something matters enough to be scary. Before anyone could respond, the doorbell rang. Kale glanced at the clock. 7:30 a.m. was early for visitors in Ashford Valley. I'll get it, he said, but Lyra was already standing. It's probably for me, she said. My friend Tony said Rodriguez's family would be sending something. At the front door, a delivery driver waited with a small package and an overnight envelope, both addressed to Lyra at the Birchwood Lane address. She signed for them with hands that were steadier than she'd expected, thanking the driver before closing the door. Back in the kitchen, Kale and Orion watched as she examined the packages. The overnight envelope was from Rodriguez's family in Texas, formal condolences and information about his funeral, which had already taken place. But the small package bore different markings, routing stamps that suggested it had traveled through official military channels. This one's from Tony, she said, recognizing his handwriting on the label. Rodriguez's squad leader. She opened it carefully, aware that Kale and Orion were watching, but not hovering, giving her the space to process whatever she was about to receive. Inside was a letter in Tony's familiar scrawl, and something wrapped in military-issue cloth. Lyra read the letter first, her eyes moving quickly over Tony's explanation. Rodriguez had left specific instructions about what should happen to his personal effects, including something he'd apparently been carrying since their last deployment together. Something he'd told Tony was meant for the logistics specialist, who kept us all alive when everything went to hell. With trembling fingers, Lyra unwrapped the cloth bundle. Inside was a small wooden carving, a bird in flight, its wings spread wide, carved with the kind of meticulous detail that came from having too much time and not enough to do with worried hands. On the base, in Rodriguez's careful lettering, were the words, "For Lyra fly free." "Oh," she breathed, cradling the carving like it was made of something more precious than wood. "Jimmy, your friend made that?" Orion asked softly. Lyra nodded, not trusting her voice. Rodriguez had been many things: a talented soldier, a natural comedian, a man who could find humor in the darkest situations, but she'd never known he was an artist. The carving was beautiful, the kind of gift that spoke to deeper understanding, to the recognition of one soul by another. "He must have been working on it for years," she said finally. "Tony's letter says he started it during our second deployment, kept adding details every time he had downtime." Cale leaned closer to examine the carving, his expression thoughtful. "It's beautiful, and the inscription ... Jimmy always said I was too careful, too worried about everyone else to take care of myself." Lyra ran her finger along the bird's smooth wing. "He used to joke that I'd forgotten how to fly." "Maybe he knew you'd figure it out eventually," Orion said, with the quiet wisdom that seemed to be his gift. Lyra looked around the kitchen, at the morning light streaming through windows, at Cale's construction plan spread across the table, at Orion's physics homework and the evidence of a life being lived with purpose and care. "Maybe I have." The job interview that afternoon went better than Lyra had dared to hope. Clearwater Construction's owner, Margaret Clearwater, was a woman in her 60s who'd built her company from the ground up and had little patience for anything that didn't work efficiently. She listened to Lyra's explanations of military logistics with the sharp attention of someone who understood the value of precise coordination. "Cale tells me you've been homeless," Margaret said bluntly, and Lyra appreciated the directness even as her stomach clenched. "Yes, ma'am. For about 6 months. 6 months. PTSD, among other things." Margaret nodded as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "Half my best workers are veterans dealing with some form of service-related challenge. The difference between the ones who succeed and the ones who don't isn't whether they have problems, it's whether they're willing to work through them." She offered Lyra the position on the spot, with a salary that was fair and benefits that included mental health support specifically designed for veterans. It was more than a job, it was a pathway back to the person Lyra had been before the war, and toward the person she was becoming in the warmth of her chosen family. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table celebrating with a meal that Orion had insisted on cooking himself, Lyra found herself thinking about the bird carving that now sat on her dresser upstairs. Rodriguez had been right. She had forgotten how to fly, had spent so many years focused on survival that she'd lost sight of what it meant to truly live. But sitting here, listening to Orion explain his physics homework with passionate intensity, while Cale offered gentle corrections based on practical construction experience, watching these two people who'd become her anchor and her launching pad all at once, she felt something that might have been wings beginning to unfurl. "I have something to say," she announced as they were clearing the dishes, surprising herself with the formal tone. Cale and Orion both stopped what they were doing, giving her their full attention. "8 years ago, I saved a little boy's life, and thought it was just a moment, just one of those things that happens, and then you move on. But I was wrong." She looked from Cale to Orion, her voice growing stronger. "It wasn't just a moment. It was the beginning of a story that took 8 years to finish. And I want you both to know that I'm not staying because I saved Orion's life. I'm staying because you saved mine." The silence that followed was full of the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. Outside, the spring evening was settling over Ashford Valley with the promise of longer days and new growth. Inside the blue-gray house on Birchwood Lane, three people who'd found each other through storm and circumstance and the mysterious mathematics of love sat in the presence of something that felt remarkably like coming home. Rodriguez's carving caught the last light from the kitchen window, its wooden wings spread wide in permanent flight, a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that bring us not to new places, but to the people we were always meant to find. 6 months later, the first thing visitors noticed when they walked into the blue-gray house on Birchwood Lane was the laughter. It seemed to live in the walls now, woven into the very fabric of the place like an additional layer of insulation against the cold. The second thing they noticed was how naturally the three inhabitants moved around each other, as if they'd been a family for years rather than seasons. Lyra stood at the kitchen window watching Cale and Orion work together in Sarah's garden, though everyone called it our garden now. The autumn harvest had been spectacular, their first full growing season together, producing more tomatoes, squash, and herbs than three people could reasonably consume. They'd spent the last few weekends canning and preserving, filling the pantry with mason jars that caught the afternoon light like stained glass windows. "Dad, you're planting those too close together," Orion was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. At 18 now, he'd grown another 2 inches and developed the kind of quiet confidence that came from being loved unconditionally, while still being held to high standards. "Since when did you become the expert?" Cale replied, but his tone was fond, teasing. The gray in his beard had spread a little more over the months, but the lines around his eyes were from smiling more than from worry these days. "Since Lyra taught me how to read the seed packets properly," Orion shot back. "Some of us actually pay attention when she explains things." Lyra smiled, turning away from the window to check on the roast that was slowly cooking in the oven. Sunday. Dinners had become a tradition, often expanding to include Margaret Clearwater and her husband, or some of the other veterans from the Clearwater crew, or neighbors who'd become friends. The dining room table that had once seemed too large for just Cale and Orion now regularly hosted 8 or 10 people, filled with the kind of conversation that built community one shared meal at a time. The job at Clearwater Construction had exceeded every expectation Lyra had dared to hold. Her first project, the residential development on the outskirts of town, had been completed 2 weeks ahead of schedule and significantly under budget, earning her a reputation for the kind of precise coordination that turned chaotic construction sites into models of efficiency. Margaret had already talked to her about partnership possibilities, about maybe expanding the company's veteran outreach programs, but more than professional success, the job had given Lyra something she hadn't realized she'd been missing: the satisfaction of building things instead of surviving things. Every foundation poured, every frame raised, every family moved into a new home felt like evidence that the world was still a place where good things could be created, where hope could take physical form in 2x4s and shingles and gardens, planted with faith in future harvests. "Lyra," Orion called from the backyard, "come settle an argument about bulb spacing." She stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, pulling her sweater, one of Sarah's, which Cale had offered and she'd accepted, closer around her shoulders. The backyard had transformed over the months from Sarah's original garden into something that reflected all of their contributions: Cale's practical vegetable plots, Orion's experimental herb spiral, and Lyra's addition of a small memorial corner, where Rodriguez's carved birds sat among plants that attracted actual birds, a living tribute to a friend who'd learned to fly by teaching others to do the same. "What's the crisis?" she asked, settling on the ground between the 2 men who'd become her anchor and her wings all at once. "Dad thinks we can plant these tulip bulbs 6 inches apart," Orion said, holding up a package with clear spacing instructions. "The package says 8 to 12 inches. "I've been gardening longer than you've been alive," Cale protested. "And yet Lyra's tomatoes were bigger than yours this year," Orion replied with the devastating logic of youth. Lyra looked between them. These two people who argued about bulb spacing with the passion most families reserve for sports teams or political candidates, and felt the familiar surge of gratitude that had become as natural as breathing. This was what happiness looked like. She'd learned it, not some grand gesture or dramatic moment, but the accumulation of ordinary Sunday afternoons where the biggest crisis was to lip placement, and someone always made sure there was enough dinner for whoever might stop by. 8 to 10 inches, she said diplomatically. And we plant them in clusters, not rows, so they look more natural when they come up. Thank you, Orion said, shooting his father a triumphant look. Don't gloat, Cale said, but he was smiling. Besides, I was testing you. Had to make sure you were paying attention to the expert. They worked together as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the three of them moving with the easy coordination of people who'd learned to function as a team. Lyra found herself thinking about the storm that had brought her to this backyard, this family, this life that felt both impossible and inevitable. The necklace, Sarah's necklace, now hung in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, displayed alongside family photos and Orion's academic achievements, and the small wooden bird that served as daily reminder that love could transcend death, time, and the careful logic that said families had to be born rather than chosen. Sometimes visitors asked about it, and Lyra would tell them the story, watching their faces change as they realized they were witnessing something that bordered on the miraculous. But most of the time, she didn't think about the necklace as a symbol or a connection to something mystical. Most of the time, it was simply part of the landscape of home, as natural and essential as the photographs of Sarah that still graced every room, as the basketball hoop where she and Orion shot hoops while discussing everything from college applications to the philosophical implications of quantum physics. Lyra, Cale said, his voice pulling her back to the present. Penny for your thoughts. She looked up to find both men watching her with expressions of fond familiarity. They'd learned to recognize her contemplative moods, just as she'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when Cale was missing Sarah more acutely, or when Orion was stressed about school applications, or when either of them needed the particular kind of understanding that came from someone who'd also learned to rebuild a life from pieces that had once seemed irreparably broken. Just thinking about how different everything is from a year ago, she said. How impossible this would have seemed if someone had told me about it while I was standing at that bus stop. Do you miss it? Orion asked quietly. The way things were before? Lyra considered the question seriously because Orion deserved serious answers to important questions. Did she miss the simplicity of only having to worry about herself? Did she miss the freedom of not being accountable to anyone else's happiness or well-being? No, she said finally. I don't miss being alone. I thought I was independent, but I was really just isolated. There's a difference. What's the difference? Cale asked, settling back on his heels and giving her his full attention. Independence means you can take care of yourself, Lyra said. Isolation means you think you have to. Independence is about strength. Isolation is about fear. As if summoned by their conversation, the first drops of rain began to fall, not the fierce storm that had brought them together, but the gentle autumn rain that coaxed the last flowers of the season to bloom and prepared the soil for next year's growth. They gathered their tools and headed inside, where the house welcomed them with warmth and the smell of dinner nearly ready and the promise of an evening spent in the comfortable company of people who'd chosen to love each other, despite or perhaps because of all the complicated ways their lives had intersected. Later, as they sat around the dinner table sharing stories and making plans for Thanksgiving dinner and Orion's college visits, Lyra found herself looking around at the life they'd built together and understanding, finally, what Sarah had meant when she'd told a crying soldier that heroes don't get to decide what they deserve. Maybe none of them had deserved this particular miracle. Maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was that love, real love, the kind that transcends biology and circumstance and the careful rules about how families are supposed to form, didn't concern itself with deserve. Maybe it concerned itself only with need and growth, and the infinite human capacity to heal each other simply by showing up day after day, with open hearts and willing hands. Outside, the rain continued to fall, gentle and life-giving, washing the world clean for whatever came next. Inside the blue-gray house on Birchwood Lane, 3 people who'd found each other in a storm sat in the warm circle of chosen love, proof that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that bring us not to new places, but home. 1 year. To the day after the storm that changed everything, Lyra stood once again at a bus stop in downtown Ashford Valley. But this time she wasn't alone, wasn't soaked to the bone, and wasn't carrying everything she owned in a battered backpack. This time, she was waiting with Cale and Orion for the arrival of someone else who needed what she'd found in their family hope. Margaret Clearwater had called that morning about another veteran, a young woman recently discharged from the Navy, who'd been living in her car for the past 2 weeks. She'd heard about Lyra through the Veteran Services Network, heard the story of someone who'd found her way back from the edge, and she was wondering if maybe lightning could strike twice in the same small town. "Are you nervous?" Orion asked, now a confident college freshman home for the weekend, his acceptance to the State University's engineering program having filled the house with celebration just months before. Terrified, Lyra admitted, adjusting the sign she held. With the woman's name Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez. "What if we can't help her the way you helped me?" Cale, now sporting a wedding ring that matched the one Lyra wore a simple ceremony in Sarah's garden just 3 months prior, with Orion officiating and Margaret as their witness, squeezed her hand gently. "Then we'll figure out what she does need, and we'll help her find it." It had been his idea to start what they'd informally called the Second Chances Project, not a formal organization, just a commitment to paying forward the miracle they'd experienced. Over the past year, 3 veterans had stayed in their guest room, each for different lengths of time, each finding their own path forward with the support of people who understood that sometimes the journey home takes longer than anyone expects. Bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes and the rumble of a diesel engine that had seen too many miles. Lyra watched as passengers began to disembark, looking for the woman whose photograph Margaret had shown her dark hair, cautious eyes, the particular kind of alertness that came from too many nights sleeping where safety wasn't guaranteed. She saw her immediately. Elena Vasquez stepped off the bus with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to travel light and move quickly, a single duffel bag slung over her shoulder and an expression that Lyra recognized with painful clarity. The look of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness from strangers. "Elena?" Lyra called out, stepping forward with the sign. The young woman's eyes found hers, and for a moment, Lyra saw herself as she'd been a year ago, proud, scared, carrying wounds that went deeper than anyone could see from the outside. "I'm Lyra," she continued, offering a smile that she hoped conveyed warmth without pressure. "We talked on the phone yesterday. This is my husband Cale, and my son Orion." Elena's expression shifted slightly at the word family, as if she were trying to process the idea that strangers would claim her, even temporarily, as one of their own. "Thank you for coming to get me," Elena said, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who'd learned to be grateful while maintaining emotional distance. "Thank you for letting us," Lyra replied, and meant it. As they walked toward Cale's car, a newer model now, purchased when the old Honda finally gave up the ghost, Lyra found herself remembering that first terrifying ride to Birchwood Lane. How everything about accepting help had felt like admitting defeat. Now she understood it differently. Now she knew that accepting help wasn't about giving up. It was about choosing to believe that tomorrow could be different from today. "So," Orion said as they drove through downtown Ashford Valley, pointing out landmarks with the casual pride of someone who'd grown up in a place he genuinely loved. "Lyra tells us you were in the Navy. What did you do?" Elena's answers were careful, minimal, but Lyra could hear the intelligence behind them, the competence that military service had built and civilian life hadn't yet figured out how to use. It was a familiar story, one that played out in small towns and big cities across the country. Everyday talented, dedicated people falling through the cracks between military structure and civilian independence. "We're not trying to fix you," Lyra said suddenly as they turned onto Birchwood Lane, the blue-gray house coming into view with its wraparound porch, and the garden that was already showing the first green shoots of another spring. "We're just offering you a safe place to figure out what comes next." Elena was quiet for a moment, looking out at the house that had been Lyra's salvation and was now her home. "How long did it take you," she asked finally, "to figure it out?" Lyra considered the question as Cale pulled into the driveway. How long had it taken? To feel safe? To believe she deserved good things? To understand that family could be chosen, as well as born? "I'm still figuring it out," she said honestly, "but I'm not doing it alone anymore, and neither will you." That evening, as Elena settled into the guest room that had once been Lyra's refuge, the three of them sat on the porch. In the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of their neighborhood, settling into another peaceful night. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell was ringing the hour, and Lyra thought about the strange mathematics of love, how it multiplied rather than divided when shared, how giving it away somehow created more of it. "Do you think she'd be okay?" Cale asked quietly. "I think she'll be exactly what she needs to be," Lyra replied, her hand finding his in the comfortable darkness. "Just like we all were." Above them, stars were beginning to appear in the deepening sky, each one a small light in the darkness, each one proof that even in the vast emptiness of space, beautiful things could find each other and create something that illuminated the world around them. And in the blue-gray house on Birchwood Lane, four people who'd learned that families come in all forms, and that second chances are often third or fourth chances in disguise, settled in for another night in the ongoing miracle of choosing to love each other, one ordinary day at a time. 3 years after the storm that changed everything, Elena Vasquez stood at a podium in the Ashford Valley Community Center, addressing a room full of veterans, families, and community leaders gathered for the annual Second Chances Gala. She wore a crisp business suit and the confidence of someone who'd found her place in the world, but around her neck hung a simple silver chain, a gift from the woman who'd first shown her that accepting help wasn't surrender, but courage. 3 years ago, Elena began, her voice strong and clear, "I stepped off a bus in this town with nothing but a duffel bag and a head full of reasons why I didn't deserve anyone's kindness. I was wrong about a lot of things then, but I was especially wrong about that." In the audience, Lyra sat between Cale and Orion, her heart full as she watched the young woman who'd once reminded her so much of herself, now addressing a crowd of 200 people as the newly appointed Director of Veteran Services for the county. Elena had found her calling in helping others navigate the transition from military to civilian life, and the program she'd developed was already being replicated in 3 neighboring counties. "The family that took me in that night didn't just give me a roof over my head," Elena continued. "They gave me something I'd forgotten I was worthy of receiving: unconditional love. They showed me that the strongest thing you can do isn't surviving alone. It's choosing to build something beautiful with other people." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Lyra found herself thinking not about the recognition or the success stories, but about the quiet moments that had made it all possible. The morning Elena had finally laughed at one of Orion's terrible jokes. The evening she'd helped Cale repair the porch railing without being asked. The night she'd cried in the kitchen while making sandwiches for a veteran's shelter, understanding for the first time that her pain could become purpose. After the ceremony, as people mingled over coffee and dessert, Lyra stepped outside onto the community center's back patio, needing a moment to process the overwhelming gratitude that sometimes struck her like lightning when she least expected it. Hiding from your own success? Cale asked, joining her in the cool evening air. Just thinking, Lyra replied, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. About how impossible this would have seemed that first night. Not just Elena's transformation, but all of it. The fact that we've helped 17 veterans find their footing. The fact that you and I are married. The fact that Orion calls me mom now. The last part still made her eyes mist. It had happened gradually, naturally, the way all the best changes did. First, Lyra, then Mom, when he was excited or hurt or needed comfort, and finally simply Mom, as if she'd always been part of his story. The fact that there's a waiting list of families wanting to foster veterans in need, Cale added, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. The fact that Sarah's necklace inspired the design for the program's logo. Lyra touched the pendant that now hung on a chain around Elena's neck, Sarah's necklace, passed on again to someone who needed its reminder that love creates more love, that giving creates abundance rather than scarcity. Do you think she knows? Lyra asked softly. Sarah, I mean. Do you think she knows what started with her act of kindness? Before Cale could answer, Orion appeared in the doorway, now 21 and finishing his engineering degree with plans to work in sustainable construction, following in both his father's and Lyra's footsteps in his own unique way. Mom, Dad, they want you inside for the group photo, he said, and then grinned at their expressions. Elena specifically requested that the founding family be front and center. As they walked back inside, Lyra thought about the chain of connections that had brought them all to this moment. A woman's last-minute decision to give away her necklace. A storm that forced a chance encounter. A family brave enough to love someone they'd helped before they knew they'd helped her. A community willing to believe that everyone deserves a second chance. The photographer arranged them in front of a banner reading, Second Chances, Building Community Through Compassion, with Elena and 17 other veterans whose lives had been transformed by the simple act of being seen, valued, and loved. As the flash went off, capturing this moment for posterity, Lyra understood that this photo would one day sit on someone else's mantelpiece, in someone else's story of impossible connections and unexpected grace. But for now, surrounded by her chosen family and the family they'd helped create for others, Lyra simply smiled and held tight to the truth that had taken her so long to believe. That love, once given freely, never truly ends. It multiplies, it spreads, it transforms everyone it touches, and it proves, over and over again, that the most ordinary moments often hold the most extraordinary magic. The storm that had brought her to Birchwood Lane was long over, but its legacy lived on in every life changed, every family formed, every person who learned that accepting help isn't weakness, it's the first step toward becoming strong enough to help others. And in a world that often felt broken, that was nothing short of miraculous. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.